if I start by saying the words group project, how do you feel? Yeah, I've seen different faces like I expected. So some of you are excited about that. You say, yes, group project. And some of you are terrified by that. And the difference is, those of you that are excited are the members of the group who didn't do anything, while those who don't want the group project are the ones that did the project. So talk to everybody and find out who's who. But with a group project, obviously the idea is to do something together, and when you don't do it together, it becomes a lot harder. So just ask those who are wincing. When you're trying to do a whole project that the group is supposed to do together, it becomes a lot more difficult. And the same thing is actually true with evangelism. We don't really think about it that way, but we're going to talk about this idea today that evangelism is really a group project. And so we've been talking about this idea of letting our light shine, and we've taken different opportunities to talk about good ways to do that, to let our light shine, some tips, some ways that we can think about it and use that practically. So we've been looking specifically at evangelism, at shining our light in that way, as our theme for this year. And so I want to talk about one of the things that I think we most commonly misunderstand about sharing the gospel, about evangelism, and that is that it's a team effort. It's not a solitary project. So lone evangelism, for one thing, it's not as helpful as evangelism in a community, and it's also not as biblical. We usually, I think of it as something that I accomplish by myself, but if you look, most of the examples are really not somebody doing it on their own. Of course, God, in His power, makes all kinds of exceptions to the rule, and there are exceptions in this room as to how it's usually done. But if we look at Scripture, even back in the Old Testament, we see that this is a community thing, a team, a collective effort. And I think a lot of us probably have a sense that this is true. When we start having conversations with people and we start studying, we want to introduce them to our church family. We want to get them involved with other Christians, because I think we have an internal sense that I need help, that it's better if I get others involved. And when we really, really actually understand this, when we really, truly understand that evangelism is a collective effort, I think it's both freeing and empowering. That this is not something that I have to figure out on my own. I don't have to have all the answers. And also, I have help. I have people backing me. I have a community behind me. And so really our big idea that we're talking about is that our common practice of solitary evangelism is not really all that helpful. And sometimes it can be seen in Scripture, but it's not as scriptural as community-based team evangelism. So evangelism should be a team effort, is what we're talking about today. And so to start off our discussion, I want to address some common assumptions that we have when we think about evangelism and what that looks like. So picture in your mind the typical example of evangelism. What does that look like? You meet a stranger, and you explain the gospel to them, and you answer all of their questions, and you study the Bible with them magnificently. They come to church. They're baptized. They immediately assimilate into the church body with no problems, right? And then everyone marvels at how wonderful of an evangelist you are. And that's how we really think about it in practice. And there are other assumptions in that example that we won't touch, as like just talking to strangers and things like that. But in that example that we usually probably think about, that it's up to me to find somebody and to explain everything and to answer all the questions and to get them plugged into the church, and that this is something I do and then I'm recognized for it, the emphasis is on my efforts and my success, and I largely do it alone. And that's not how it actually usually works. We think about that, but if you think about real examples of people that you know who have come into the kingdom, that's not what it looks like most of the time. So I actually want to think about some real examples which undermine our assumptions. So I want to consider examples of people that basically all of you are going to know, to try to see how does that line up with the way that we usually think about it. And so in these examples, I think what we're going to see is that evangelism is both personal and collective. And what I mean by that is it's personal, it's based on relationships. Sometimes it happens through a social media video or someone hearing about a sermon, but usually it is personal. It's based on a relationship that you have with another person, whether that's a long-term one or a brief one. And it's also collective. Usually there is a whole mess of people involved to where you can't really point to one particular individual and say they did it. It's collective. And so the first example I want to talk about is my wife, Salem. So most of you probably know that my wife did not grow up in the church. And I would also not say that I evangelized her, because I was a teenager who didn't really care at that point, to be honest. And so in some ways, I usually say that she evangelized me in return. That's a story for another time. And it might not be the precise order, but what led to my wife's becoming a disciple is that she was searching, and we had some spiritual conversations, mostly about the fact that I knew everything and I was right and everybody else was wrong. But we had spiritual conversations. She attended worship with me because she was interested, and I extended the invitation. And then we spent a lot of time with family and friends who were Christians. And she developed relationships with them, especially other women, and then she committed herself to Christ after that. I don't recall answering really any questions. I didn't really do a whole lot. It was her getting plugged into the community of disciples that really made the difference. And I can think back about some of my aunts and cousins and other friends and people who really made the difference, because it was a collective effort and it was based on relationships that happened. I was the initial contact, but I didn't do it. It was a team effort. And the other one I want to talk about is Brace. I didn't tell him because I knew he wouldn't have a problem with it. And I've only had a couple conversations with Brace about this, but there are some patterns that are pretty prevalent in that. Brace had been somewhat active religiously, and then he met Dawn, and he was exposed to other Christians, and he began to study with other Christians, and Brace became a true disciple as he saw it. Dawn didn't answer all the questions. She actually apparently didn't want anything to do with him at first, which was interesting. And it was him being introduced and being brought into that community of Christians that made the difference. So do you see the common themes within those two examples? These are people that you know, and these are pretty typical examples of what happens. It wasn't Dawn or myself that did everything in answering all the questions and fielding every responsibility and objection that would happen. What happened, whether it was realized or not, is that we tagged other people in and made it a team effort. I didn't do that consciously. It just works naturally because that's the way that it usually happens. That's not the way that we assume that it happens, is it? What we talked about in our assumptions and the typical example of the way we think about it is not the way that it actually happens, to where there are a lot of people involved and it's built on those relationships. And I think if we pay attention, we'll find that most occurrences of evangelizing reflect that. Most situations, there are some differences, some unicorns maybe we'll say, but usually it's a team. It's not a lone person that are doing this. And I want to talk about some scriptural examples where we'll see it's the same thing of being personal and collective. And these are the examples usually of what we find in Scripture too. Of course, sometimes God completely takes the reins, and he does something very direct with an individual because he's God, and he can do that. But usually what we see is this same type of idea that there's this community influence, this sharing of the news that seems to be more common. And so this is actually woven into the story of Scripture, if you think about it. When God began to choose his people, all the way back at the beginning, they were to be witnesses to others around them. And you can even think about that in terms of Noah and Abraham, that they were witnesses, they and their families, to the people that they came in contact with, and they were supposed to share who Yahweh God was with all the people around them. It's all the way back at the beginning, but we can see it very clearly through ancient Israel. So the ancient people of Israel were to show the greatness of God in their lives together. So they were supposed to be different from the nations around them and do all kinds of different things. Be holy for I am holy, so people would know who God was. And in their interactions with other nations and with people that would come into their presence, they were supposed to, together, show a different way. And so consider this objective that Moses gives them in Deuteronomy chapter 4. In Deuteronomy 4, and starting in verse 5, he says, "Look, I have taught you statutes and ordinances as the Lord my God has commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to possess. Carefully follow them, for this will show your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the people. When they hear about all these statutes, they will say, 'This great nation is indeed a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call to him?' You are supposed to live a certain way according to these regulations that I've given you when you go into the land, so that people will see the wisdom of God at work among you. You're to testify to the nations around you who the God of Israel is." And really, if you look at the Old Testament, it was a call of evangelism. And sometimes that worked. And you can see instances where other nations were brought in and they became part of the people of God. Think of the Gibeonites that we talked about a few weeks ago. Or the idea that there were prophets that were working in other nations. But God said, you together are supposed to be a collective society to show people my ways, to show them the wisdom that I have given you. So Moses reminds them that their collective way of life was to represent God to the nations so that they would consider his way and be drawn in. And this was part of what all of those rules in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers are about, is showing the people around them a different way. And then consider this also, switching gears just a little bit. How are people going to know who Jesus' disciples are? And how are they going to be exposed to the actual living out of his message? A verse that we talk about all the time. Jesus says in John 13:35, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." So think about that again in this collective mindset that Jesus is intending it. Nowhere does it say that people will know because a couple of you are going to just have a masterful understanding of apologetics, and you're going to be able to answer all questions and objections, and you're just going to know how to bring everyone in, and you're just going to have to rely on those couple of people who are talented at evangelizing. That's not what Jesus says. He says people will come to see me because of your relation and work with each other. This is a collective thing. Our collective lives and working together is what demonstrates to people that we are Christ's true disciples, right? Here's another one. What was highlighted about the church in the book of Acts? So periodically in the book of Acts, if you pay attention to how Luke has written it, he gives these summaries of what's going on with the disciples. And he said they were doing all these kinds of things, and he'll usually end it by saying, And God was growing the church, and the Spirit was doing all kinds of wonderful things. And one of these is in Acts chapter 2. So we know this passage, and starting in verse 42, it talks about, and day by day going to the temple and breaking bread in their homes. So starting about all of the things that the disciples are doing together in public and in private that people are seeing. And in verse 46 it says, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. You notice the connection there between the two sentences in verse 47? The people are seeing what the disciples are doing. It's causing them to have favor with the people. And that is what God is using to bring more into the church, to increase their numbers. This being able to see the collective lives of the disciples and their work together and their team effort of proclaiming the gospel of Christ, and that is what God uses to grow the church. So we're going to look at another example of this in particular in just a second, but there's something really important that we need to understand, is that the church is an opportunity for people to see a real life example of God's love and power at work. The church is a real life example of the gospel. And that is not an accident. God has designed that on purpose. That's what we see here. That's what we see Paul talking about in 1 Thessalonians 2 that Josh read for us. That we didn't just share the gospel with you, we shared our lives with you so that you could see what God was doing among us. The church is an opportunity for people to see God's love and power at work. And there's a similar statement later in Acts chapter 5, verses 13 through 14. This one's really interesting. It talks about, again, their collective action together. And then verse 13 says, none of the rest dared to join them, that is, the people who were seeing them worship in the temple, but the people held them in high esteem. And more than ever, believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women, and so on and so forth. But Luke notes this, that everyone said, wow, look at those people. But most people said, I don't actually want anything to do with that, because of how different and sort of scary it was. But everyone said, wow, there's something great going on over there. But the people held them in high esteem. And even though some people said, that's really cool, but I don't want to do anything with that, God still uses that to bring more people into the church. It is their collective action and what people were seeing happening among them, this sort of team effort, this collective community sort of idea that God uses to add believers to the Lord. People were seeing the disciples and what they were doing, and that together, what they were doing was what was bringing people to believe the gospel. And so sometimes sharing the gospel does happen alone. I mean, we can see that in some of the things that Paul does, but most often it is best done in the context of a collective team effort. It's not just you going out as the Lone Ranger and figuring everything else out on your own, but it is usually best done in the context of a team project. And this is what our theme verse for the year describes. So if we think about this in these terms, so we've been talking about this, it was mentioned this morning, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the people, to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And usually we'll read this, and we'll say, verse 16, it's talking to just me. That is taking it out of what Jesus is talking about. He's speaking to the disciples, if you look at the beginning of the chapter. Let y'all's light shine is what he's saying. Let your light shine in that way. And we can see this based on what he says in verse 14. You are a city on a hill. You're a community on display. There's no way that we can take that and think that it's just talking about me and what I do. I am included in that city on a hill. I am included in that collective shining of the light. But it's not just about what I do. So we are a community on display. We are to do this together. This is where God is showing his love and his power in the working of the gospel in our lives. The church is a very purposeful organization, community, whatever you want to say, because of what God is doing it in that way. And so thinking about this, and we look at these examples and what Jesus has said, that evangelism is personal and it's collective. That is where God's power is at work. This is where the gospel is being lived and where people can see a real example of what God is doing in the world. So it doesn't make sense if we try to share the gospel without the community of faith. It doesn't make sense. If the church is where God's love and his power and the working of the gospel is demonstrated and real and alive, it doesn't make sense for us to try to then go over here and do it completely by ourselves. I saw an illustration that someone gave. It's like trying to dig a trench with a kiddie shovel, and then when you take a break, you're leaning on a backhoe. It doesn't make sense. Our greatest tool, the untapped power of the supernatural gospel, is at work in the church. And it is our greatest tool for evangelism. And we need to understand that evangelism is personal and it is collective, and the church is our greatest asset. We are a team, we are a community, we are a city together. And so then I want to talk about some practical tips for shifting our mindsets, for putting this sort of team, collective effort into practice. And so some of these I have worded myself. Some of these are adapted from a book called The Compelling Community. But I want to talk about this, and we will note 3 this morning, ways of putting into practice this idea of team evangelism. So the first one is that we talk about our life in the church with other people. And what I mean is your friends and your relatives and your coworkers. You talk about your life as a church member, your experiences in the collective community of faith. And what I don't mean is you just only try to give the best possible, like you're selling them a house or something. That's not what we're talking about. But also on the other side, we're not airing all of the dirty laundry of everything that happens. We're giving a real and transparent view of what it is to be involved in the church. Because that shows God's power. It shows God's love. It shows a way that is very different from what people are experiencing about communities out in the world. And so what we mean by all this is we talk about it honestly and transparently. So just a general example is, we're facing this problem in our congregation, and this is the way that we're dealing with it. We have these differences of opinion, and people don't necessarily agree on what to do, but because of our love for each other, we're able to set aside those differences and work toward a common goal. That doesn't usually happen in the world. So we don't sugarcoat it, and we also don't lambaste and just talk about how everyone's a hypocrite and everything is going badly, right? So for one thing, in doing this, we demonstrate the primary place that the church has in our lives. That this is really our prime connection. This is our family. We are all connected on something that is transcendent and spiritual. Not just blood, not just common interests, but something that is eternal. And then we also give examples of God's love and power at work. We talk about people who have made mistakes and the ways that they have been restored, or the ways that we have rallied around someone in some kind of tragedy or negative experience. We are giving actual examples to people of what God is doing among us. So maybe someone's relative dies in a tragic accident, and we talk about how everyone came together to give them what they need, to support them, to encourage them. And that doesn't always happen in the world. So we're showing examples of God working in and among us by doing this, by talking about our life in the church with others. And this is a lot more natural than you think it is. This is not about just always trying to find some way to fit it into the conversation. It should be natural. It should be something that we talk about because it should be important in our lives. If we talk about our experiences of forgiveness and reconciliation and love and the things that we are able to do together, it shows God's own love and reconciliation and power at work and gives people a tangible example of the way that things are supposed to be. The second one is, instead of just stories, instead of just telling people about it, we can expose people to what we're talking about directly. So months ago, we talked about this idea of merging our universes, and that's really just the idea of mixing our social circles, so getting friends and relatives who are not Christians together with some of our friends that are disciples. And so we talked about this idea of mixing non-believing friends and family so that they're able to come into contact with other believers. And again, this can be a natural way. You have your kid's birthday party, you invite some of your friends from church in addition to your relatives. It's just something that simple so that they are able to come in contact with other examples and able to see your interactions with them, the love that Jesus is talking about, the transformation that happens. And one thing that I found that a lot of people say is that they don't realize how different and real and deep the conversations that Christians have with each other are. Because out in the world, when you're just scrolling on your phone, trying to avoid thinking about reality and the problems that happen, you don't really want to think about the deep things. But Christians talk about life with each other. And they have ways of thinking and processing things that a lot of people in the world don't have. And that's just a side example, a benefit that I found in personal experience. So this exposure and relationship building is a huge thing. And it can be something of you get together with some friends and you know, hey, Zach would be a really good person for my friend over here to talk to. Because maybe they've gone through something similar, maybe they have a lot of shared interests that I don't necessarily have with this person. So hey, you guys should get together, or why don't we go do something together so that you guys can get to know each other a little bit more. And it is tagging people in, it is building these relationships so that God's power can be shown. It shows them the gospel being lived out, is a way to put this very simply. It exposes them to God and the gospel being lived out in people's lives. And so the last one, we're talking about evangelizing as teamwork, right? And so sometimes we need to tag in our teammates. Sometimes we need to ask for support. So maybe someone asks you a question that you don't know the answer to. But hey, I bet so-and-so knows the answer to that. Or maybe they're talking to you about an experience that they're having or a struggle they're having, and you say, I have no idea what to think about this because I've never gone through anything like that. But hey, I know such and such in my church family who has gone through that type of experience. So maybe we could get together and all talk about that. So maybe there's a question you don't know how to answer. Maybe you have no idea how to sit down and study the Bible with someone. Or maybe you realize that whoever you're building a relationship with would really benefit with being connected with some other believers. But we need to tag other people in. I think this is one of the biggest areas that we fail is we think, I have to talk to this person and I have to win them and I have to do it all myself so that I'll just meet the assumptions that we all secretly hold about what evangelism looks like. But really, the humility and the love that is shown in bringing other people in and making them involved is extremely powerful. It is very powerful. We need to realize that we should have others surrounding us and supporting us and able to assist when we're trying to shine our lights with other people. I don't know all of the answers to everybody's questions that I talk to, but I bet somebody here does. I haven't experienced everything in life, but I bet somebody here has experienced something like that. And, you know, some people enjoy doing some things that I don't want to be caught dead doing, but I know some of you weirdos like doing that stuff too. So we bring other people in because that is making it personal and collective. And these are examples of what to do. And if we're not willing to do that, if we're not willing to bring other people in and to ask for help, that is a red flag as to our motivations. And it's also a missed opportunity, I think. So we need to remember in talking about this that the church is where the gospel can be seen at work and where people can be exposed to God's power as it's operating. And it doesn't make sense for us to try to do that in isolation. Our family here is our ultimate tool in sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with other people. This is where God's power and God's love are manifested. You know, as we say, I tried not to write it in my notes, but I had to. Teamwork makes the dream work. And it's true. When we think about the dream in the case of our mission of sharing Christ with others, that's how we accomplish it. Teamwork, team effort, community involvement, collective work together. And we need to be consciously resisting the temptation to go it alone. To think, I've got to answer all the questions, I have to know how to sit down and study with someone and be able to do it perfectly. But we instead need to welcome and rejoice in the fact that we are part of a team, that we have help, that God has put us here on purpose because He wants us to work together into sharing this message. And I'll just put a plug in for myself. If you don't know how to study with someone or you have no idea how to answer questions, use me. That's part of why I'm here, is so that I have the time to assist with things like that. So you can say, you know, I know this guy Ethan, and he's incredibly handsome and charismatic, and he can answer any of your questions, and none of that is true. But seriously, if you don't know what to do, if you have questions, talk to me, and I might say, you know what, I have no idea how to handle that either, so let's go talk to somebody else. But I will personally put myself forward as someone that you can tag in at least as a first contact. We need to be thankful that God is not expecting us, God does not want us to go it alone, but He's put us here together. So then thinking about disciples, as we are going out and fulfilling our mission of sharing and shining our lights, what ways can I improve in getting others involved? How does that encourage me to be more proactive in sharing the gospel when I realize that there are others that can help me in doing this? How can I talk about my life as a church member with other people? How can I mix my social circles so my friends and family can be exposed to the church and to the gospel at work? How can I utilize my family here in order to show the power that God has put among us? Let's be thinking about those. And if you're new here or you're not part of a spiritual family, I want you to notice that the way that we've been talking about community and cooperation with respect to the church is very different from what you're going to see in the world. It's different from what you're going to see about teamwork and cooperation in the workplace and at school and in the government. And that's not because we're better people than everybody else, but that is because of the God who works among us. So we all want to belong somewhere. We all want to have a community and be a part of something. And God has amazingly created the church to give us many of the things that we need and to have a place where we can encounter His power at work in the world. So the question is, do you want that? Do you need that? Do you want a place to belong, a place to see and to experience what God is doing? If that appeals to you and we can help you in some way, then talk to any of us at any point today, tomorrow, throughout the week. or you can come chat with me on the front row as we stand and sing.